Good morning. I'm Erica Bond, Vice President of Justice Initiatives at John Jay College of Criminal Justice. On behalf of the entire John Jay community, I'd like to welcome you to the second day of the 18th annual Harry Frank Guggenheim Symposium on Crime in America, which is hosted by our Center for Media Crime and Justice. This year's theme is reporting on gun violence, engaging the public on the issues and equitable solutions. In particular, I'd like to welcome the reporting fellows and the journalists in our audience. As many of you know, this symposium was established to provide you with information, sources, and topics to inform high-quality reporting on justice and safety themes in America. Yesterday, we hosted panels that discussed crime trends, the challenges and opportunities around existing crime and victimization data, community violence intervention, and the role of government leaders in addressing the gun violence epidemic. If you missed any of these panels, please know they will be available online in the coming weeks. Yesterday, we also acknowledged the recipients of this year's annual prizes for excellence in criminal justice journalism, Jen Abelson and Nicole Dunga from the Washington Post, and Samantha Michaels from Mother Jones. The winning submissions address two critical issues: the implications of no-knock warrants and failure to protect laws. I encourage all of you to check out these important pieces of journalism, which we will share in the chat. For today's program, we're pleased to present three panels. At 10:15, shortly, Rachel Marshall, the Executive Director of John Jay's Institute for Innovation and Prosecution, will moderate a conversation with district attorneys, a police chief, and a journalist about both the enforcement and non-enforcement work that police and prosecutors are engaging in to stem gun violence. After a 10-minute break at 11:30, we'll have a panel that will discuss legal strategies for reducing gun violence. That'll include litigation strategies as well as law and policy reforms. After lunch at 1:30, we will host a panel of reporters to discuss how the press can and should report on the tragedies of gun violence. And then the program will end for the general public at that point. However, at 2:40, we invite the reporting fellows and other journalists in attendance to host a dedicated roundtable that'll be moderated by Maurice Posley. We'll put a link in the chat to the full agenda. Now, before we begin the first panel, I have the pleasure of introducing Congressman Maxwell Frost, who will be providing opening remarks. Just some brief background on Representative Frost. He is the first member of Generation Z to be elected to Congress and represents the people of Central Florida in the United States House of Representatives. As a former organizer, musician, and community activist, Frost was inspired to get to work at 15 years old after the tragic mass shooting at Sandy Hook Elementary claimed the lives of 26 innocent people. From that moment on, Frost dedicated his life to fighting against gun violence and empowering communities across Florida and the United States to get behind gun reform, including joining forces with those affected by the Parkland and Pulse shootings to shed light on this epidemic. In 2016, after years of organizing and advocacy work, Frost himself became a survivor of gun violence after witnessing a shooting in downtown Orlando. The experience only further committed him to fighting for common sense solutions to this senseless loss of life through leadership roles at the ACLU and eventually March for Our Lives, where he served as the national organizing director. In Congress, Frost is committed to representing the people of his hometown in Orlando and Central Florida and being their voice in Washington, D.C. There is so much more that we could say about Congressman Frost, so please check out his full bio in the chat. Thank you for joining us today. I will now turn the mic over to Congressman Frost for your opening remarks.
Yeah, well, thank you so much for having me on. And hello, everybody. It's good to be here. Once again, I'm Congressman Maxwell Alejandro Frost. I proudly represent Florida's 10th Congressional District in the United States Congress. That's Orlando, Florida, and Central Florida. And I always like to start with talking very quickly about my story. I come from organizing. I come from knocking doors, making phone calls, being on the front lines of protests, and truly believe that our story is one of the most powerful things that we have. And as a politician and as a leader in my community, It's my job to tell my story and connect to the story of my community, and I bring those stories to Washington, D.C. I got started in politics when I was 15 years old, a little over a decade ago. And I went to an arts middle school and high school. Before every jazz band concert, I was a jazz drummer for about 7 years in school. We'd go to I think it was a Fridays that was across the street from our school. So we'd load up on a ton of junk food right before the concert. It was tradition. And I remember we're there eating, and there's a silence that falls across the entire restaurant. We look around, we look at each other, we finally look at the television screens and see that somebody walked into an elementary school in Newtown, Connecticut. He murdered 20 children and 6 teachers. Well, that had a profound impact on me. I grew up in the suburbs. I was adopted at birth and grew up in the suburbs where daily gun violence was not a normal factor in my life. And so seeing those images of those kids being marched out of their elementary school with their hands in the air and their little book bags and the SWAT surrounding them, it made me highly uncomfortable. And as we all know, when you're the most uncomfortable and most vulnerable, those are often times where you're most open to having your life changed. I remember going to the concert that night, not being able to play correctly at the show, dragging, rushing, missing hits because I kept looking behind me at the exit sign because I was scared somebody would walk into that theater and shoot myself, my friends, my family, and everyone I knew and loved. And that anxiety is something that my generation, but many generations live with right now on a day-to-day basis. After that, I went to Washington, D.C. for the memorial that was going on for all the victims of the shooting that happened in Sandy Hook. And it was there meeting the families, meeting kids that were my age who just a few weeks earlier lost their loved ones due to gun violence is really what was my call to action. I remember I called my mother and I said, Mom, for the rest of my life, I want to fight for a world where no one has to feel the type of pain I saw in people this weekend. And I went back to school, wanted to figure out how to organize, started petitioning in the ways that I could. I collected like 800, 1,000 petitions from friends in school saying, hey, we want action on gun violence. I didn't know anything about politics at the time, so I delivered the petitions to my principal, who was like, thank you for these. I didn't know the principal couldn't really do much in terms of legislation on ending gun violence, but that was the first time I ever worked at exercising my power and building power with my peers. So I got involved in organizing, ended up working on many campaigns, worked for the American Civil Liberties Union for about 2.5 years, and then became the national organizing director for March for Our Lives, the movement that came after the shooting that happened in Parkland, Florida. And, I have to say, I had some friends who came up to me who said, Maxwell, you should run for Congress. I said, hell no. And having conversations with people in my community, connecting with my biological mother, all these different things in a like 2 month time span is what pushed me to run. And I guess I made the right decision because I'm here with y'all today and it's a blessing. I have to say the last 9 months have been the longest 2 years of my life. Congress has, been a whirlwind. I wake up every morning incredibly excited, honored, blessed, and grateful to be able to represent my home in the United States Congress. But there's been a lot of dysfunction, right? I mean, I'm tired of being a part of history because the last 9 months have been very historic for not just Congress, but for our country. From me being sworn in and having to go through 15 rounds of voting to elect the Speaker of the House, being sworn in a House chamber at 2 a.m. on a Saturday night or on a Friday night, to just a few days ago, as we all know, for the first time in our country's history, we don't have a Speaker of the House in the middle of our session because the chair was vacated. And so now Congress is thrown into another round of chaos. But despite all the chaos and all the weird history that's been made over the past 9 months, I'm very proud of the work that we've done despite the constant dysfunction we see in Congress and the fact that we're dealing with a majority that wants to be more focused on criminalizing trans kids and banning books and et cetera, these steps into right-wing fascism, more interested in working on that than working on the issues that people care about on a day-to-day basis, opportunity, safety, being safe in their communities. The first bill that I introduced as a member of Congress is the Office of Gun Violence Prevention Act of 2023. Gun violence is really the issue I've been working on my life, my entire life. 3 years after getting involved in this fight at 15 years old, 3 years after that, Pulse happened, where 49 angels were murdered and taken from us too soon because of armed bigotry and armed hate. 3 months after Pulse is when I became a survivor of gun violence here in downtown Orlando on Halloween night. So that's one of the many reasons why the first piece of legislation I introduced was to create a federal office of gun violence prevention. And believe it or not, this is actually something that I had been working on for years prior to me getting into Congress as the organizing director at March for Our Lives. This was an ask all of our organizations had really come up with years ago because we knew it'd be hard to get good legislation through the United States Congress, and we wanted to, push the administration to do them themselves. And so this was the first bill I put into law. Now, or the first bill that I introduced. Now, as a freshman member of the minority in the United States Congress, especially in these 9 months, it's difficult to get things done. It's really difficult. This bill, I've went up to Republicans and said, "What do you think about this?" It's not necessarily gun policy; it's infrastructure to end gun violence. And what I was told by many of them behind closed doors is, Maxwell, y'all got a gun bill passed last year. You're not going to get one for a long time. And that's what a lot of folks have told me after mass shootings and after these horrible shootings that happen. And for people in the audience who don't know, up until a few weeks ago, we've never had a federal office of gun violence prevention, one coordinating entity amongst all our different agencies and departments and offices that work on this issue. In fact, it's always been split up between many different departments and agencies, from the DOJ to HHS, ATF. Even the Department of Education has a portfolio in gun violence. And so it's hold on, I'm getting a message here. It's important to know that this is something that our country has not had, where we're losing 100 lives a day due to gun violence. The leading cause of death for a child, if God forbid your child before the age of 18 were to die, the leading reason for that would be bullets in this country. And we've not had a single entity coordinating all this work in our country until a few weeks ago, where I received a call from the White House and they said, "Maxwell, we're going to take your bill and we're going to make it into law through executive action." And that's what happened. I had the honor of standing alongside the president and the vice president in the Rose Garden to introduce and talk about this bold executive action, which created a federal office of gun violence prevention, staffed with experts in that work, experts from gun laws to community violence intervention to everything. And what we know to be true is this issue needs to be dealt with holistically. And my problem with the right wing is you speak with people on the right wing and they just want to talk about mental health and pigeonhole on that. You talk with people on the left wing and they just want to talk about gun regulation and pigeonhole on that. And what I've learned from being on the front lines of this issue my entire life, pretty much, is we have to deal with it holistically. Yes, it's gun regulation and making sure guns don't get in the wrong hands. Yes, it's mental health care and it's healthcare in general and making sure people have access to resources. But it's also knowing the nuance of that. Knowing that if you actually study the numbers, we find out that people with serious mental health conditions, because I'd argue that all of us have mental health problems, but serious mental health conditions are more likely to be shot and not more likely to shoot someone. These numbers are important when dealing with gun violence. So it's healthcare, it's gun regulation, it's upping the standard of living in this country, poverty, etc., so that way people don't feel the need to use a gun to solve their problems in the first place. All these things are connected. Gun violence is an issue, but even more than an issue in and of itself, it's the symptom of root problems in this country. And that's why all of these issues are connected. And when we view it holistically, we best set ourselves up to actually deal with the problem and create a world free of gun violence. And so I'm very honored that in less than a year, we have been instrumental in getting this federal office already made. Time for the next thing, because there's so much work we need to do in ending gun violence. And it's going to take all of us, from activists on the streets to progressive DAs and state attorneys, as we call them here, to good people on school boards, to state legislators, to municipalities, etc. There's a lot of work to do here. The last thing I'll say is community violence intervention, which is giving money to communities so that way they can work at ending gun violence before it even happens. What I'm interested in are proactive solutions to ending gun violence, not reactionary measures. And I think that's important in this fight. So I want to thank you all for having me here today. In the words of the late great Congresswoman Barbara Jordan, what the people want is simple: a country as great as its promise. The foundation of that promise is safety and security in our communities, and ending gun violence is paramount in that. So thank you so much for having me.
Wonderful. Thank you, Congressman Frost, for sharing your story and really reinforcing for us how deeply traumatizing and painful gun violence is for people and communities nationwide. Want to thank you also for reminding us that we have the power to create a future where we address that trauma and prevent future harm, using the very many tools that are available to us and really addressing this problem from all angles. So we appreciate your advocacy, and we thank you for coming to speak and for all of the work that you've put into making that Office of Gun Violence Prevention at the federal level a reality. So now I will turn the mic over to Rachel Marshall, who's the Executive Director of our own John Jay Institute for Innovation in Prosecution, for a really important conversation about one of the tools that we have, and actually multiple tools that DAs and prosecutors have in addressing the gun violence epidemic. So Rachel, take it away.
Thank you so much, Erica, and welcome to everyone who's joining us for our panel on guns and enforcement as part of the 18th annual Harry Frank Guggenheim Symposium on Crime in America. Today's discussion is going to look at the role of law enforcement and prosecutors in preventing and reducing gun violence using what we just heard from the Congressman, our proactive approaches. We're going to talk about innovative ways that are effective in combating the gun violence epidemic, and also ways that avoid the harms that tough enforcement approaches may inflict on communities, and particularly communities of color. We have several highly distinguished panelists with us today, and we're going to be placing a link to each of their full bios in the chat, as they have way too many accomplishments for me to list right now, and we encourage you to read those bios. I'm going to briefly introduce them before we start with questions. First, I'm going to introduce Brooklyn District Attorney Eric Gonzalez, who has been Brooklyn's first Latino DA since 2017 and has implemented substantial reforms to enhance equity, responsiveness, and efficiency while engaging Brooklyn's diverse communities. Also with us is another reform prosecutor leader, Travis County, Texas District Attorney Jose Garza, who was elected in 2020 and brings an invaluable perspective of how our criminal justice system works and impacts all communities, as he is a former federal public defender, immigrant rights activist, and leader of the systemic change organization Workers' Defense Project. Welcome. We are also thrilled to have with us DeKalb County, Georgia District Attorney Sherry Boston, who was elected in 2016 and is another national leader in criminal justice reform and innovative prosecutorial approaches. And I wanted to mention that DA Boston recently led the litigation challenging Georgia's new law, SB 92, which seeks to undermine democracy and prosecutorial discretion. And the IIP was proud to author an amicus brief in support of that litigation. Welcome. Also with us today is Chief Todd Schmaderer, who was appointed Chief of the Omaha Police Department in 2012 and has overseen a historic 50% reduction in gun violence in Omaha through really innovative community-centered approaches that we're going to be talking about in just a few moments. And finally, we are honored to have with us Lakedra Chavis, staff writer at the Marshall Project, who has written really extensively and thoughtfully on gun violence and enforcement, particularly in Chicago. So welcome to all our panelists. We are delighted to have you. And I'm going to dive into the discussion, but I encourage everyone in the audience to put your questions in the chat. We will be reserving time at the end for questions, and we'll get through as many as we can. So I want to start briefly with setting the stage a little bit. And Lakedra, I'm going to turn to you. Before we dive into some of the challenges that we see through traditional enforcement solutions to gun violence, I want you to think, you've written extensively and reported extensively on gun violence in Chicago, as I mentioned. Tell us who is most impacted by this problem, and particularly who is most impacted by criminal enforcement of gun laws?
Yeah, so I think when it comes to who is impacted by gun violence, it depends on where you're looking, which cities you're looking at, which type of gun violence you're looking at, to get at that question. What we know about gun violence and gun deaths is that most of them are suicides, which primarily affect older white men. Primarily, when we talk about gun violence, we're talking about interpersonal gun violence or community level gun violence that can disproportionately affect Black men, usually late teens through late 30s. And then there are also mass shootings, which are quite rare in the sort of scope of gun violence, types of gun violence, but they tend to sort of be the catalyst for policy changes. But when it comes to who is sort of affected by the enforcement of gun laws, which we sort of ideally have in place to keep the public safe and to have safer communities, what my reporting has found and what lots of research has found as well is that we enforce gun laws primarily through illegal gun possession, which is what it sounds like, which is just having a gun with either lacking the proper paperwork if you're in a state like New York, Illinois, California, or you might have a criminal background which would automatically prohibit you, regardless of the crime, from owning a gun legally. And in addition to that, with the primary focus on gun enforcement being for illegal possession, what I also found in my reporting is that it is overwhelmingly Black men who bear the brunt of this kind of enforcement. So when we talk about who is affected, it's this huge group of people, all kinds of people who are affected by gun violence. But when it comes to enforcement, it's a very, very small group. And for me as a reporter, the question is always, is this working the way that we want it to work, the way we tell ourselves that it's working?
Thank you so much, Lakidra. And Chief, I want to bring you in to follow up on that. We're going to talk in just a few moments about a lot of the very innovative, proactive approaches you've used in Omaha with great results, as I mentioned. But first, I wanted to sort of establish, why do you see, building off of what Lakidra just said, this need to turn to new approaches? What have you seen as the limitations of relying solely on sort of tough approaches to gun enforcement? And I guess what I'm asking is, why can't we arrest or prosecute our way out of this problem?
Yeah, thank you. And good morning to everyone. Thanks for having me on the panel. First of all, we cannot arrest ourselves out of this. It's simply too linear. It doesn't address the cause, the root of why we got into that situation. So we end up just spinning our wheels, thinking that we can arrest ourselves out of a particular matter. Omaha's a 500,000 population. We've got 1 million metropolitan area. Our primary driver of gun violence in our city is really gang and gun violence. And somebody asked me one time, Chief, would you rather have 1,000 officers or 1,000 new jobs? And I said, I'd take 1,000 new jobs if it's done and placed in the right positions and pays a decent enough wage. The reason I say that is I'm trying to get at the root. I'm trying to get at the cause and trying to even out a playing field. Otherwise, we're continually spinning our wheels, making arrests, when we never change why we're making those arrests. And so that's why I think that you can't arrest yourself out of this. I think it's a three-prong approach of precision policing, so that we try to leave the law-abiding citizens alone, strong sense of community partnerships, and I really think that third pillar is addressing root causes.
Thank you so much. Dia Garza, I'm going to turn to you. Guns, as we've been talking about throughout this conference, are the leading cause of death in so many jurisdictions, including in Texas. And what do you see as the driver of this uptick in gun violence? And what I'm mostly curious about is, how does it affect your approach as a prosecutor in terms of solutions? And what do you advise other prosecutors as well?
Yeah, good morning. It's an honor to be on this panel. I'm looking forward to learning from my colleagues today and from all of you. I really appreciate the Chief's comments. I think he's hit the nail right on the head. We know what public safety is. Public safety is, as the Chief said, it's access to good jobs, it's access to good schools to send our children, to healthcare, to mental health care. It is stability. And so it is no surprise that after going through a once in a century pandemic that disrupted work, that disrupted school, that disrupted our places of worship, that caused an enormous amount of instability, that we saw gun violence rise in 2021. That fact, coupled with the mass proliferation of firearms throughout our country, we also have to bear in mind that in 2021, there were somewhere near 20 million firearms purchased in the United States, somewhere around 17 to 18 million in 2022. Those numbers eclipse every single year of firearm purchases this century. And again, so when you combine instability and easy access to firearms, no one should be surprised that we saw a spike in gun violence. Here in Travis County, we know that over the last 10 years, a plurality of all homicides arise out of a domestic violence context. But the truth is, we need better, more granular data to give us a real-time sense of how and why gun violence is happening in our communities. And law enforcement plays a really critical role in helping us to understand the details, the context in which gun violence is arising. Addressing gun violence arising out of domestic violence is a different challenge than gun violence that's arising out of gang violence. And so it's really important in every jurisdiction to have that granular level of data to allow us to craft strategies and solutions.
Thank you. DA Boston, I want to bring you in particularly on that domestic violence conversation that DA Garza just brought up. In Georgia, a huge percentage of domestic violence related homicides are committed by folks with firearms. What do you see as tools that are needed to get guns out of the hands of those who are most at risk, given what we've been talking about in terms of the proliferation of guns? Most at risk of committing violence, I should say.
Yeah, so I mean, we've been working hard to really strengthen the laws in Georgia to make sure that we can deal with issues like domestic violence and mental health. And so it's first important for those of us in the criminal justice system to push back on societal beliefs that equate equality with mental illness, right? I mean, we know we have these, equate criminality with mental illness. I know we have these discussions because we are concerned about guns getting in the hands of people that perhaps should not have them because they are not capable mentally of having them. And it creates this stigma dealing with those that are mentally ill, who are more likely to be victims than perpetrators of the crime. And it also shows that criminals can use the cover of psychiatric illness to evade criminal punishment. Also with domestic violence, we know that when firearms are involved, it's 400% more likely, right, that there's going to be death when we're talking about a domestic violence situation when there's access to a firearm. And so we continue to push in Georgia, primarily on the domestic violence front, to get Georgia law to mirror federal law, right? But we also know that there are folks that are trying to chip away at the federal laws that we already have in place, specifically meant to protect people that are victims of domestic violence, where we already have federal laws that say if you are convicted of even a misdemeanor domestic violence, you are not eligible to possess a firearm. But in the state of Georgia, I, as the local prosecutor, can't even prosecute that case because it's not state law. And we know that our federal partners are up to their eyeballs in dealing with lots of criminal offenses and lots of drug and gun-related offenses. And where they can't be is down in these small local level areas, right, where we know we have someone that's convicted of domestic violence. They're coming through our system, and we're still finding they have access to firearms. So we have to continue to work to change the legislation locally and nationally to make sure that we can protect our communities from both firearms with domestic violence and firearms on the mental illness side.
DA Gonzalez, I wanted to bring you in because we've been talking about all of these increases in gun violence across the country, but yet at the same time, Brooklyn has seen gun violence decline. Can you tell us about that? And what do you see as the primary reason for the decline in gun violence in Brooklyn? And what lessons can it offer to other jurisdictions across the country?
First of all, good morning, Rachel, and to my colleagues. It's good to see everyone, especially Sherry and Jose. It's been a while since I've been in your presence. But listen, in Brooklyn, like every other jurisdiction, and Jose touched upon it, in 2020, we saw crime really skyrocket and violence really skyrocket. And we saw a few things in terms of domestic violence. We started to see connectors between family violence and people who had reported incidents of domestic violence, and looking at a 3-year window, many of those young people who lived in those homes were also involved in gun violence. So we're starting to see that the influence of home life on the ability for young people to engage in violence, in particular gun violence, there's definitely something that needs to be studied more. But as district attorney, I think that part of my obligation, besides prosecuting these cases, is really to help inform the practices and policies of our city, and to talk about the things that we see on the ground working. Brooklyn, we're trying to do a lot of different things to combat gun violence. I'll say that we're down 40% year to date in gun violence from last year, and last year we were down 30%. So we're really making substantial progress. We're at pre-pandemic lows. And there's a lot of things that we're working on. We continue to focus in on the small number of people we believe will use a gun to actually hurt someone or shoot someone, as opposed to simply everyone in possession of firearms. I run a diversion program in Brooklyn meant to divert people who we don't believe are carrying guns to commit crimes, but are carrying guns for the reasons a lot of people carry guns, for their own personal safety, because they are afraid of violence in their community, trauma that they've sustained. Many of them have lost people to gun violence. So we talk to these young people when they get arrested, and they tell us they don't feel they can access law enforcement, that they can't speak to the police. They don't think the police will protect them. And so there are things that have to work around that. And so I've really have tried to work with community-centered programming in those communities. So we have a bunch of different programs trying different things. They're not all the same, but they're intervention programs done with trusted mentors and ambassadors from the community. Some of them are violence interrupters, some of them are credible messengers, some of them have different sites, but we're trying different ways to engage young people and to get them to not carry guns. And it's been working. And I am happy to say that reducing the supply, doing some trafficking cases with our federal partners, working with NYPD to reduce gun violence and to get guns off the streets, enforcing red flag laws like DA Sherry Boston was talking about. But the biggest success, and anyone who tells you they know how to end gun violence, I think is overpromising. But the biggest success is working with community members and giving them a co-led public safety responsibility. And I heard our chief talk about that, working together with community partners to try to reduce and mitigate violence. And the final point that I'll say, and I'm a big believer, and this may sound oversimplified, but when you create pockets of peace, you get a peace dividend. Much of the gang violence is retaliatory. So if you're able to reduce that, to mitigate, to have restorative practices, you won't get retaliation, you'll stop shootings. And so I think Brooklyn right now is in the middle of a peace dividend.
Thank you so much. And Lakidra, I want to bring you in because the DA just mentioned that a lot of young people are carrying guns for protection. And you've written a lot about the concerns that many of us share. in how enforcing gun enforcement and penalties disproportionately affect young Black men and communities of color more broadly. Can you share more about what you've seen in your reporting in terms of disproportionate impacts? And from your perspective, how should prosecutors and police address or respond to those disparities in the enforcement of gun laws?
So in terms of the, the reason that young people carry guns, it's in line with the reason that most people in the US carry a gun or want to have a gun, which is this feeling of being unsafe, or there might be a threat to their safety. That's something I heard a lot when I was a local reporter here in Chicago covering gun violence and solutions to gun violence. But it's really a kind of universal feeling or justification for wanting a gun. But when it comes to enforcement, what we found looking at Chicago for a little over a decade, so from 2010 to 2022, was that in a city that constantly has headlines for shootings and sort of mass shootings that maybe don't make national news, was that the police have arrested 38,000 people, made 38,000 arrests for illegal gun possession. About 8 in 10 of those arrested were Black men. And if that is like a hard number to visualize, that is enough people to fill an entire Chicago Bulls game. Like, that's how many people we're talking about. And at the same time, as many of you know and have experienced in your own communities, there's been in the past decade, every now and again, spikes in gun violence. And what we found is that despite this massive uptick, especially in recent years, and the arrests for illegal gun possession, that the same communities experiencing this type of policing actually weren't seeing an increase in the number of homicides or non-fatal shootings even being solved. So for the more than 30,000 victims of gun violence in that same time period, there was like a 20% chance that there would be an arrest made in their case. So you have, on one hand, a lot of people being criminalized for how they try to approach feeling safe in their communities, whether we sort of agree with it morally or not. And then you have people who are victims of gun violence, have maybe witnessed a shooting or lost someone to a shooting. And then there's a very small chance that they will even see a sort of criminal system type of justice in that tragedy taking place. And then there's a lot of overlap in that group. So that's what we saw in Chicago, and we saw these disparities play out in cities like New York and in Houston and in Cleveland, Ohio as well. So it is not something unique to Chicago. It's happening, unfortunately, around the country. And again, it gets back to what I said earlier, which is this really helping us to address the type of issues that we're trying to address when it comes to community gun violence, especially. In terms of what prosecutors and police officers or police departments can do, I would be really curious to hear from the rest of the panel. From the perspective of a reporter, what I found really, really interesting is that even if there is this sort of radical change among individual prosecutors or individual police departments, superintendents, or police officers, the system is really designed to allow this type of enforcement to not only exist, but to persist. We have specific laws in place, specific rulings in place that allow things like stop and search, especially if someone has a gun. We have these laws that make the sort of threshold for prosecuting someone who is caught illegally possessing a gun, or maybe they don't have a concealed carry license, very low. And so I think, and again, I'm not a prosecutor or a police officer, but I think it can be very difficult to change these kind of systemic issues when you're sort of operating in a situation where there are things on the books that allow these kind of disparities, not only in enforcement, but who the enforcement is sort of geared towards to continue to exist.
I appreciate that. And, a lot of prosecutors' offices have responded traditionally to gun possession and gun violence charges with very strict office policies. They may impose mandatory minimums or harsh sentencing schemes. I would like to invite the DAs. I'll start with you, DA Gonzalez. What is your response to that approach?
Well, I think I touched on it in Brooklyn. There's a real deep dive and an analytical approach to when a person is arrested with a gun, trying to make certain assessments of who's before the office, the court. Are they, why do they have the gun? What's, leading them in possession? And, we see different things. And for those who use guns to hurt others and to commit violent felony crimes, we prosecute those cases vigorously. But what we see is there is a racial justice aspect into gun enforcement. Much of the victimization in my county are African Americans and Latinos. I mean, together make up over 95% of the victimization, and they make up about 90% of those who are arrested for unlawful gun possession. And so, making believe that there should not be some, look at this problem with racial lens to see what kind of things can work to make sure that people are treated fairly in our justice system, I think is a mistake. And so I run a diversion program in the county that's designed to give people who are first-time offenders who've been arrested with a gun a chance to successfully navigate, get their lives back on track, avoid criminalization and convictions. And we have a mandatory minimum in New York State. First arrest is 3.5 years. And so, we see that, especially with our youngest offenders, 16, 17 years old. It seems like to give up on them and to throw them away and put them in state prison for a minimum of 3.5 years, plus, 5 years of parole is destroying your lives. And so I take a look at these cases, focusing in on who are drivers of crime and looking very carefully about the reasons for the possession. And when I find young people who are possessing guns because of gang membership and they're afraid, one of our programming efforts is to work with people who are gang involved and provide positive role models and positive things to help eliminate their involvement in the gang. It's not an anti-gang program, but it's really meant to show other ways. And we work with mentors and people to give life skills and to get them back on track. And so I don't support mandatory minimums. I've never have. I believe that judges and prosecutors need the discretion to make the appropriate decisions, and every decision has to be individualized.
Thank you. DA Boston, I wanted to get your take and also to ask you about some of the approaches that you've used in your office. I know you started at a firearm violence prevention unit. I'm hoping you can also tell us about that unit, how you approach this problem from a prosecutorial perspective.
Well, for us in Georgia, unlike my friend DA Gonzalez in New York, in Georgia, we have extremely lax gun laws. And what we like to say in our office is everybody's got a gun problem. Because everyone is allowed, we have permitless carry in Georgia. So concealed or non-concealed, you need no permit. As long as you're over the age of 18 and have not been convicted of a felony, you can possess a firearm. And by the way, everyone does. And so what we see is whether it's illegal possession, meaning people that have already lost their right to possess a firearm, or it's people that are lawfully allowed to carry a firearm, those two things are obviously going to increase gun violence and gun crimes for a myriad of their own reasons. And so one of the things that my office did, and we did this during the pandemic, as we started to continue to see our legislature continue to make it easier and easier and easier for there to be a plethora of firearms everywhere. I started the Firearm Violence Prevention Unit in my office. It's the first of its kind in Georgia. It has an ADA, an investigator, a victim advocate, and a social worker. And those partners work collaboratively with other units in the office to reduce the proliferation of gun violence in the community. They focus on identifying gang members, repeat offenders, and others with illegal possession of guns. And then we work with our federal partners to investigate firearms cases with domestic violence components and bring federal charges as appropriate. Because as I stated earlier, it's very difficult for us to prosecute on the state level. But when we see very violent offenders that continue to have a firearm and they have a history of domestic violence, we will work with our federal partners to help bring federal prosecutions. And then I think two of the most important pieces of this unit are not prosecution based. Similar to DA Gonzalez, we take the position that we have to work with our communities to engage in peaceful conflict resolution solutions, as well as curbing violence before it happens. So our community advocate works directly with victims where shootings have happened, even in those cases of unresolved or uncleared shootings. Because what we know is that even with beyond gangs, many of our shootings are retaliatory in nature. And so if we can reach out and give services, especially in those uncleared cases where people feel like nobody was arrested, nobody is being pursued, they've gotten away with it, everybody in the community knows who done it, and then the reaction is, we're going to go out and get our own level of justice, right? So we work with victims in the community to persuade and try to avoid people from engaging in that type of retaliatory violence. And then finally, we do a huge educational component because everyone has a firearm, right? And I mentioned in Georgia, you don't have to have a permit. You don't even have to take a class or get any instruction of how to safely store, load, keep your firearm. So we have kind of taken on that mission in the DA's office, is that we create an environment where we're doing firearm safety and education. We are encouraging and giving out gun safes and gun locks. We are having programs with both of our teens and adults about how to safely handle firearms. And what we saw in the last year was a significant increase in accidental discharge deaths because young children were able to access firearms both in vehicles and in parents' bedrooms that were unsecured. And so all of those things together, we really want to work. So one of our new initiatives is called Keeping It Real, and REAL stands for Responsible, Educated, and Lawful Gun Ownership. So it's called Keeping It Real, Keeping It Safe. And that is kind of our initiative. And we continue to make sure we do these types of things during National Gun Violence Awareness Month, with giveaways to the public and also educating them about how we can do things better. And I will say one of our most successful engagements with the community was when I brought my firearm instructors out into the community, and every 30 minutes, we had a demonstration where we were showing people how to safely unload, clear, and store their firearms. And that was instrumental because I have senior members of my community that want to have guns in their homes to feel safe. But I want those seniors to also understand how to do these things safely. So that's a big part of what we've been doing with our firearms violence prevention unit, which is prosecution and community-based, working together to reduce gun violence in our community.
Fantastic. And Chief, speaking of community, I want to talk about some of the work that you did to engage the community and some of your innovative approaches in Omaha. I'm hoping you can talk about the 30-30-30 program, which decreases enforcement focus and increases prevention and intervention. Tell us how you did it and what you think can be learned from your successes in Omaha.
Yeah, thank you. So over a 10-year run, we've probably reduced shootings in our city by about 50%. And we noticed about 10 years ago, we were 90% enforcement, 10% intervention and prevention. And that was our highest point of shootings in the history of Omaha. We thought to ourselves, we can't continue to sustain this. So we work closely with the community. We have a group in Omaha called Empowerment Network 360. It's an umbrella organization that brings in all the community groups that might assist with street level gun violence, reentry programs, housing, educational gaps, you name it. And we meet every Wednesday at 2:00. And for 10 years strong, the staying power is impressive. We still have 100 people attend the meetings every day. And what that has done, it morphed into a 90-10 enforcement model to a 30-30-30, and take that 10% and apply it wherever you want, depending on the trouble of the day. And that 30-30-30 mix, which was a progression to get there. Sometimes when you're in a high crime city, you might need to be a little stronger with the enforcement piece at first, but your goal should be that 30-30-30. And once we hit that 30 intervention, 30 prevention, 30 enforcement, in which, by the way, the intervention and prevention is heavily community involved, and even the enforcement is to a part where we inform the community as to what we're doing. It created this nice synergy of reduction, but also a synergy of unity. Police community relations has gone up significantly, and our data reflects it on various vital signs. Clearance rates are 80 to 90% for homicides in Omaha. It used to be 45. Shootings have been down 50%. Because your shootings are down, in general, the homicides have gone down. We're at 40-year lows after the pandemic. So it's really a highlight and a buttress for intervention and prevention and community work. And then when you talk about that law enforcement piece, look, it's got to be precision, it's got to be precise, it's got to be data driven, it's got to be informed. I'm not a fan of saturating an area full of police officers. The only thing that does in the aftermath of a shooting is you end up stopping all the good people that live there, and then you kind of start reversing the trend. So that's the formula that has worked in Omaha. Not to say we don't have our issues, we do, but that formula also helps trying to get in the middle of those spikes in violence and those retaliation moments, because everybody's working on the same page.
DA Garza, you have also been a leader in establishing the importance of collaborative responses in your community to this problem. In 2021, you established a partnership with the police department in Austin and community partners, and used a 4-pronged strategy along with a gun violence summit that brought together many leaders in Austin that I'd love for you to tell us about. I won't recite it for you. So tell us about that effort and what strategies it led to and how it's been going.
Yeah, I want to start by just briefly addressing the discussion of disparities in arrests and in our carceral approach to addressing gun violence. And I think what you hear from all of us is that really we have to be focused on what works. And I think it is pretty clear at this point that a strategy that relies solely on conviction and incarceration has failed. We have, as a country, obviously one of the highest incarceration rates of any country on the planet, and at the same time, one of the highest violent crime rates of any country on the planet. And so it is really imperative that all of us follow the data and the evidence, that we include the communities most impacted by gun violence, that we empower them, and that we, in many instances, take their lead on this issue. And so, as I said, all of us lived through a spike in gun violence in 2020 and 2021. And so here in our community, we came together, law enforcement, elected officials at every level, to discuss and pursue strategies that could work. And we really took a kitchen sink approach here in Travis County. We think that accountability is incredibly important. And we've been clear that here in Travis County, if you pick up a gun, point it at another person and pull the trigger, you will be found, you will be arrested, and you will be held accountable. But we know that strategy alone is completely ineffective. And so we have worked to be centered in victims of gun violence, in collaboration with the county government and city government. We are standing up a hospital-based violence intervention program, because we know that victims of gun violence today can be perpetrators of gun violence tomorrow. And we have a moment when someone is a victim of gun violence to intervene, to meet their needs, to ensure that they have what they need to be safe, so that we can take retaliation and additional violence off the table. We are also pursuing a community-based strategy, a CVI strategy, where we have, as DA Gonzalez described, trusted messengers who can identify conflict and de-escalate that conflict before it happens. And then obviously at the district attorney's office, every single day we come into contact with people who are at risk of committing acts of gun violence, but people who we still have an opportunity to intervene with and to help be on a different path and reach their full potential in our community. And so we also have taken an approach with firearm possession cases that we are looking for indicators of past violence, future violence, and short of that, it is more effective to connect people with the resources they need to feel and be safe than it is to pursue conviction and incarceration. I think everyone on this panel is likely aware that there was a relatively recent, within the last year or so, Giffords report that focused on a program in Minneapolis that demonstrated, off the top of my head, I think a 40% reduction in recidivism when we focus on the root causes that lead people to carry guns in the first place than simply convicting and incarcerating people. We are working to build on that approach, to build on that model here in Travis County, and expand it to ensure that people who are at risk of committing acts of gun violence have their needs met, because I think in the long term, that's what's in the best interest of our safety. And so as a result of all of these strategies, we've also seen sharp declines in gun violence in Travis County over the last 2 years, a 20% reduction in homicides from 21 to 22, and an additional 30% year to date up to this point. So we have more work to do. And then, as I said, a real key component is to get the data, is to have a granular understanding of why gun violence is happening, what the context is, so that we can craft solutions to deal with it. We have an entire strategy, for example, dedicated to gun violence within the domestic violence context. We have a program that I'm excited to talk about in the coming months that is a restorative justice program for juveniles. We went back and we looked at 10 years of juvenile data here in Travis County and found that the #1 charge that juveniles face is assault family violence. And as I said, we know that's one of the leading drivers of gun violence amongst adults. And so we can craft specific strategies for that challenge if we have the data. And I think we're excited about the path that we're on.
I so appreciate those comments. Thank you so much, DA. And Lakedra, I wanted to ask you, we've been talking a lot about engaging community. What are some of the things you've heard in your reporting from communities that are most impacted about what they want to see from law enforcement, whether police, whether prosecutors, and what are the challenges you see to rebuilding trust between many communities and law enforcement?
Yeah, so I have written about gun violence mostly in Chicago, but I've also talked to mothers who have lost sons to gun violence in Philadelphia, and used to cover gun violence a little bit in Alaska as well. And what I hear from people varies. Communities aren't monoliths, even though sometimes we may speak of them like they are. And in Chicago specifically, I hear that people, they want more access to services, whether that's mental health services to help, navigate grief. They want a better understanding of the investigative process when police detectives are trying to solve the homicide of their loved one. A lot of people just don't either. They really struggle to understand how the system works, or they feel like they're not getting any response, and they don't know where the case is at. And then it just ends up unsolved, like most cases here in Chicago do when it comes to gun violence. I also hear from people who they've lost someone to gun violence and they want a sort of stronger police presence in their communities. So it's really across the board. But I think the kind of through lines that I hear from people is that they want more services, more real investment in their communities. I think a few of y'all talked about that earlier, the sort of community buy-in, but also community investment is key to address some of the underlying sort of root causes of gun violence. And these are investments that could probably be made now and are being made to a certain extent in some places. So that is typically what I hear. And then what I hear from young people, so people who are sort of in their late teens, early 20s, that I find especially troubling is the idea that you can just get away with murder. And these are often young people who have been shot, so they're shooting survivors. And they know the person that harmed them, and they are extremely troubled, but also very casual about the fact that you can just literally get away with murder. So I hear a lot of things, and oftentimes people do not, when I'm talking to them about what they want or what they feel like they need, they are not actually suggesting more or a policing centered or a prosecutorial centered solution to whatever they're going through or what they're trying to navigate. Again, what I most commonly hear is this sort of where are the police? How does this investigation work? I haven't heard anything. So more so the lack of transparency within the system and the feeling like they cannot properly access what is available. And so I think that is probably really key in terms of communicating with the public, especially victims and survivors and families of loved ones, about what they should expect from the legal process and to make sure that they have proper support in place. So I hear a range of things, but in terms of sort of solutions or revisions to the system, not so much.
D.A. Gonzalez, Lakidra was just talking about survivors. What support do you think that prosecutors are and should be providing to survivors, and what are new strategies that can be used to better support survivors of gun violence, regardless of whether maybe there's even a criminal case or an arrest?
I think that is, very key, because much of, typical responses by prosecutors are to get involved after the harm's already happened, and usually after an arrest. And I heard DA Boston say it, prosecutors need to be involved with community members before harm is committed. And so, I try to tell young prosecutors in my office that I want the community to know you, not because they've been a victim of a crime or because you're prosecuting one of their loved ones, but because you're active partners in that community. And so it goes that when the police are unable to solve the cases, that survivors and victims and their families need to have access to services to deal with the trauma. I think that, also helps to prevent a lot of the retaliation. And I'll tell you about a program. And I also just sort of want to acknowledge what the chief said, because I think that the three buckets that he mentioned are important: the enforcement, the intervention, and then prevention. And, all of those things sound similar, but they're really different approaches. What we do is when someone is injured, we have our victim services and our social workers reach out to them and make sure that they get all the services that they can get, things that they often don't receive in many offices unless there's an arrest. But the intervention, I want to lean into what we're doing in our county, which is very different. We just recently had a gang-related shooting where 3 young men were shot. One of them, all 3 have survived, but one of them has been severely injured and may be permanently paralyzed. They belong to a large gang. And so we immediately sent out our trusted CVS mentors and ambassadors, and wanted to make sure that we got services to that entire group of young men that, typically are gang involved, right? So it's beyond just the immediate families, but to all of their close friends and allies to make sure that their needs, their social emotional needs, and their their distrust of law enforcement was being dealt with. And so we've leaned into that group. We worked with an organization that does restorative justice to kind of do one-on-one individual therapy and counseling and group counseling. And we're actually working on putting together an outing for them, a peace outing to work on these things. So it's beyond just simply responding to it, but being proactive, right? That's a proactive approach, reaching out to all of the members of that, that gang, and saying, "Hey, we understand that you lost, people in your gang. All three did survive, but let's work on figuring out these solutions." And so that's what we're doing in the county. And I think the important piece of this is that we have not seen the retaliation that would otherwise have been expected by the police and really our community at large.
Thank you. I want to take a question from the chat that's directed to the prosecutors. Maybe DA Boston, I'll start with you. The question is, for the prosecutor, several of you noted that you are working to determine which arrestees are most likely to commit violence. What metrics or other strategies do you use to make those assessments?
I'll jump in real quick because I know I said that. We use social workers. We also engage with our police department in the sort of the concept of who are drivers of crime, looking at what people have done in the past and what we know about them. We also work with our violence interrupters, who often have a lot of information, community stakeholders. But we do work with our social workers very deeply to understand the young person that we're working with.
Similar to DA Gonzalez, we also are looking at the crime drivers. So in our office, when I came in, I started our crime strategies and community partnerships unit, modeled after, and give credit to former DA Cy Vance in Manhattan. And so that unit engages with all of our law enforcement partners, our public education specialists, our business communities, and that unit goes to all of our main law enforcement's what they call weekly shootings review. So we are going to those and understanding what has happened in cases even before it's cleared or an arrest is made, because we know there's an interconnection and intersection between all the folks that are involved. So we're using that as a metric to identify who we think are crime drivers in our general, category of violence. On the other side, on our domestic violence side, our domestic violence and sexual assault unit has their own metrics to determine lethality. And we are looking at those repeat offenders that are showing that we're getting high lethality for those domestic violence situations. And we're monitoring those people on that gun violence front. And that group, again, is working closely with our federal partners, and they do monthly reviews with our US Attorney's Office to review those offenders and to determine which one of those are high risk that we want to push for more intense prosecution on the federal level. So it's really important to us to not just identify everyone is not the same. And so we are looking for either those high level domestic violent offenders or violent, those folks that are committing violent crimes. And then also the crime drivers of around our shootings.
And if I could just jump in very quickly, I just want to acknowledge that this is not an exact science. This is not Minority Report. None of us have a ball rolling down the tube that tells us with certainty what's going to happen next. But everyone, and I believe everyone in our criminal legal system is doing the best we can to assess a wide range of data and information to do our best to understand who may be at risk for committing future violence. And so I wanted to just add a few layers to all of the great examples that my colleagues have named. I'll say just here in Travis County, a few other tools that we rely on is a list of risk factors that we have worked with the National Institute for Criminal Justice Reform to understand. We've also worked closely with our law enforcement partners and have relied increasingly, for example, on the ATF's NIBIN program to have a better sense. There is a difference between someone who possesses a firearm and someone who possesses a firearm that is linked to a shooting 3 days before. And so those kinds of tools help give us a more holistic view of the person that is in front of us and what the appropriate resolution is that gives us the best chance to secure our future safety.
Thank you. And we are almost out of time, so I'm going to give everyone a chance to make a final point. We'll do kind of a lightning round question. What is one change that either from your experience or your insight you'd like to see prosecutors and or police make to combat this problem? And Chief, I'll start with you.
I'd say the biggest change for law enforcement, we've been very slow with transparency over the years, and part of that transparency piece is data collection and data dissemination. So we haven't put out the data, collected it appropriately. We haven't disseminated what are the statistics out there affecting our community and analyzed it appropriately. And I think that if I can make one change, I'd make that a hallmark of policing. You must have robust, uniform data collection so that we can make extrapolations based on what our trends are all across this country. And we've attempted to do that, but it's so porous with what we have right now. That needs to be shored up. And I also think it helps get everybody on the same page. So that's a change I would like to see based on some of the discussion we heard today.
Thank you. Lakidra, I'll turn to you next.
I guess my one suggestion as a reporter would also just be more transparency in the data collection and how the data is being managed, how it's being fact-checked, how these interventions that are being used are being measured, if they are research-based, and if so, what research is it being based on? Is this sort of a scaled-up attempt or sort of a replication of something that was successful in a separate city or jurisdiction? And I think all of that is really, really important, not just for journalists to know, but so we can properly interrogate, how something is working and to the extent that something is working, and to put it in, a necessary context for our readers so the public can be more informed, and, the transparency on the prosecutor side as well.
Thank you. DA Boston.
Unfortunately, mine is just I need our Georgia laws to roll back. Because we know, and I know that DA Gonzalez will agree with me, because my colleagues in New York and Chicago tell me all the time, the guns that are making their way into the violence on our streets are coming from your jurisdiction. They're coming from Georgia. And that's because we have the proliferation of guns is so rampant. And we have very little regulation that they're coming out of our state and going to other places where and using them for violence. And so for me in Georgia, I know that not only could I solve some of the problems in my community just by having basic common sense gun regulation, I also know that we would solve issues in major cities that already have regulations, right? But they're seeing my black market guns make it their way into those cities. And so we continue to fight here to just have some reasonable common sense gun laws that will make not only Georgians safe, but everywhere in the country much, much safer.
Thank you. DA Gonzalez.
I think just continuing the public discourse in the understanding that gun violence is a symptom of underinvestment and issues of poverty in our communities, and that while all of us are working on the enforcement piece and interventions, that long-term, and I'm talking about decade year, of time needed to actually do the long-term prevention. We often confuse intervention and prevention work, but communities that have investments and are safe and healthy just have less gun violence, and we have to continue to make sure that the public discourse continues to say, if you care about gun violence, then you have to invest in communities that have been underinvested in.
DA Garza, you get the last word.
Well, at the risk of sounding naive, what I'd like to see change is for us to get the politics out of this discussion and the data and evidence into this discussion. I've been really excited to hear, and some of them because, I've talked with my colleagues about these issues before. I'm excited about the innovations that are happening around the country. And we need, as a community of law enforcement and community members impacted by these issues, to give ourselves the space to try different approaches, to be rigorous and study those approaches, and to use the strategies that work and to jettison those that don't. I think there is a move in that direction, but the reality is, and the congressman started with this point, is that too often politics prevent us from pursuing strategies that work. And I think we have a responsibility to rise above that.
That's such a great note to end on. And we too are very excited about all of the innovations, which so many of you are leading right now. Thank you all for joining. I know there's a lot more to say on this issue, and the IIP and John Jay will continue to make space for these important discussions. Thank you all for joining, and I believe the next session starts in about 15 minutes. So we will see you there. Thank you so much to our panelists and to all of you for watching and participating.